Well, my name is Aaron Stritzel. It's great to be with you all again on this fall morning. I'm streaming in from Colorado, and it's past fall here. It's supposed to snow here in a little bit, which is bittersweet. I'm excited. I love the shift in seasons. Fall's my favorite season. Anybody else there? Love fall, the changing colors, the cool crisp weather, the pumpkin spice lattes from Starbucks, which is my wife's fault. I blame her. But all of that, right? So it's an exciting season to kind of shift into the cool, brisk change, right? I love that sort of change, and the clouds are kind of rolling in where I'm at right now, and a little bit of snow is all right. Not a big problem, but just keep it not too much, right? You don't have to worry about that really in Phoenix, so hopefully the weather is starting to turn nice for you. You get to go outside more and spend more time. Before we begin, I want to say congrats on raising 2 SUVs worth of diapers and formula and different things to help people in need. It's exciting. I cheer you on. Thank you for being a part of that. And it's going to help some people that really need it. So today we continue on our sermon series on Jonah, the prophet Jonah, right? Pastor Ryan introduced the sermon series last week. And Jonah, the book, was written somewhere between 500 and 200 BCE. A little bit after Jonah the prophet, who lived somewhere around 800 and 750 BCE, right? And so Jonah is this interesting book. Scholars aren't sure what to make of it. It's bizarre. Some people argue, of course, that everything actually factually happened, and other people say, no, it was an allegory, or it's some story but covered in myth, or it's a short story, or it's a comedy, right? Parody or satire. There's all these ideas, and there's a lot of energy spent on that. I'll just say this. I was raised to believe everything in the Bible literally happened. And if you question that or wrestle with that, you're sort of doubting God, more or less. And I don't think that's the case. We can take the Bible seriously without necessarily taking it literally. We can read the Bible literarily. And ultimately, I think there's too much energy wasted on how much of this happened and didn't happen. Really, it's an ancient story, right? And so we apply it to us and say, what does this mean to us? What might it have meant to the people at that time, and how can we apply it to us? And so I hope you'll find something that speaks to you today from something I said, or it leads you on a path that God speaks to you in some other way. So just to recap from last week, Jonah is a prophet, right? And he's called by God to go and prophesy, speak on behalf of God to this group, the Ninevites. And he refuses, so he goes the other direction. And he boards a ship, and he sets sail, and we read that there's this massive storm that came, right? And the sailors are freaked out. They're trying to abandon everything, trying to save everybody. Finally, Jonah says, it's me. Just toss me over, and you guys can all survive. And the sailors, they actually don't listen to him. They try to save everybody at first. And what we're meant to see from the very beginning, when it comes to sort of like that satire, Jonah is serious and also humorous at the same time. What we're meant to see is this. From the very beginning of the story, we're meant to be challenged to see the blurring of the lines that are used to normally divide people, or label people, you could say. Jonah, the prophet, acts like an anti-prophet, right? Jonah is supposed to speak on behalf of God, refuses to speak on behalf of God, right? You have this group of sailors, these rugged individuals, who are extending compassion to somebody they don't even know. And not only that, but they're non-Jews. This is a Jewish story, but they're non-Jews acting in the way of Yahweh, right? Well, Jonah puts everybody else's life at risk. It's irony here, and it talks about the labels and how easy it is to sort of group somebody under one label and just make all kinds of assumptions, right? We've probably all done that before. And it's not working for us. In fact, labels themselves seem to be kind of falling apart and disintegrating a little bit, even in today's world, right? Under the label Christian, opposite things are done. Some people vote for and push for political candidates and policies that build walls, keep people out. And some work towards policies and vote for political candidates that try to make it an opportunity for people that are experiencing extreme poverty, hopelessness, whatever, to find a way into our country, our nation, right? Under the umbrella of Christian, Some people seek to be loving and inclusive and seek to listen and welcome and love, and other people seek to exclude and are quick to judge, right? And so opposite things happen under this name Christian, which is why I think many people like myself are wrestling with this label, right? What is meant by this label? Perhaps a more accurate question is, what kind of Christian do you want to be, right? Do you seek to really follow Jesus? What does that look like? Do you wrestle with that on a regular basis? So the story of Jonah can be divided into really 4 scenes, if you will. It's 4 chapters, short, 20-minute read or so. The first scene we talked about last week is Jonah and the sailors, really. The second scene we're going to talk about this week is Jonah and the fish. And then the third scene, Jonah and the Ninevites, and then Jonah and God. And so the second scene actually, chapters and verses were divided up later, right? So the second scene, Jonah and the fish, actually begins in the first chapter, in chapter 1, verse 17, where we read the following. The Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, interesting phrase here. The Lord provided. Here you go, Jonah. Here's a fish. Some people will interpret that as say, actually, the fish was part of the salvation for Jonah, which could be, right? I mean, an interesting phrase there to interpret it that way. But this immediately brings some problems. And it's easy to find people going into 2 extreme camps. One, everything that happened in the Bible, literally, right? Everything we read took place. Jonah spent 3 days. So we got to argue and figure out how some person was able to survive, right? And then you have the opposite extreme, people who sort of make fun of this and say, look, this is exactly why we shouldn't take the Bible seriously. It's because it's a bunch of fairy tales and fables. It's just made up stuff, right? And I want to take a third way, hopefully, that says, well, we can take it seriously, but not literally. We wrestle with what it might have meant literally, and scholars wrestle with this as well. But we take this as a story. What might it speak to us today? So I think Jonah speaks to us because it's a book about humans. It's a book about love, compassion. It's also a book about hate, prejudice, bigotry, right? Some things we see in our world today. So let's dive in together to Jonah chapter 2. So God provides a large fish, and then we read in Jonah 2, Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed me over. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head, and the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pits, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish and spewed Jonah up upon the dry land. I love that last little, just boom, there you go, Jonah. Just spew you up there. I mean, part of your salvation. There you go, right back where you should have been the whole time. And this prayer, really, this is a prayer about despair, right? This is a prayer about anguish. This is a prayer when it feels like your life is ebbing away, where the waters are enclosing in, right? We read prayers of despair most often in the Psalms, actually. For example, here's 2, Psalms 120, verse 1. In my distress I cried to the Lord, that he may answer me. Psalms 18, verse 6. In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my Lord God I cried for help. I'm so grateful for the Psalms, really, because it encompasses all of the human emotions, joy and ecstasy and celebration, thanksgiving and gratitude, and also despair and hopelessness and vengeance and anger and self-pity, right? All of those things. So if you ever find yourself going through seasons of despair or loneliness or anger, perhaps Psalms is one of those that you might find comfort in. It doesn't provide clear paths forward. I'm always skeptical when something seems to do that anyways, but it does provide comfort knowing that you're not alone in this, knowing this is part of what it means to be human. So I want to talk for a moment about this phrase that we read, 3 days and 3 nights. What is meant by this phrase? So I want to look at three other places that this phrase is used in similar ways in the Bible. Actually, one of them is in Jonah chapter 3, verses 3 through 4, where it talks about Nineveh, the city that Jonah was supposed to go to, is a 3 days walk. It's 3 days to get through the city. In another instance, in Genesis chapter 22, it's the story of Abraham taking his son Isaac to go sacrifice. Another one of those problematic, difficult stories, especially for us modern folks to understand and really grasp. But we read that in Genesis 22, verse 4, on the third day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place. On the third day, he looked up and he saw the place in the distance. In a similar way, Exodus 3, where Moses is speaking on behalf of God, telling Pharaoh, let us go take a 3 days journey into the wilderness to sacrifice and worship our God. So this theme of 3 days is all throughout a lot of the Old Testament. See, 3 days and 3 nights was, first of all, we're going to dive into two separate things here, but first it meant it's a long journey. It was just a way of saying it's a long journey. So Nineveh, which is a 3 day walk, meant it's a big city. Here's a big city, right? When you take a 3 days journey, I don't think Moses was not asking Abraham, let us go for 6 days, 3 days there and 3. He said, let us take a journey. Let us journey through, and often it's a difficult journey. Let us journey through the desert in this place. Let us take this journey, right? So the second thing, actually, that 3 days and 3 nights talks about, we can glean from an ancient Sumerian myth called the descent of Anana. This myth was 1,000 years older than our Jonah story. So it's very likely, most definitely, that the author knew this ancient Sumerian myth. The descent of Inanna. Inanna is the queen of heaven in this story, and her sister dies. So she goes to her grandfather, Enki, and Enki gives her, she goes to him because he knows how the secret passageways and everything, and how to get to the underworld. So Inanna tricks Enki into giving her those secret codes. So then she goes and she tells her servant, Ninshuber, that if she's gone longer than 3 days or 3 nights, hey, go get help. Stand guard here. I'm going to the underworld. If I'm not back in 3 days and 3 nights, go get help. All right? And we read this, when after 3 days and 3 nights, Inanna had not returned, Nishuber, again her servant, set up a lament for her by the ruins. Right? And then the story kind of continues from there. But what's interesting is 3 days and 3 nights was symbolic of the journey to the underworld. So let's look at what is meant by the underworld. In the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, the Hebrew word for the underworld is Sheol. Perhaps you remember reading that in the prayer of Jonah, right? So Sheol is the place, at least in the Old Testament, where everybody went to who died. Everybody who died went to the underworld, went to Sheol. It wasn't until in between the Old Testament and the New Testament till life after death was further developed to say, oh, people who went to the underworld are people who needed to be punished for some wickedness or bad thing they did, right? And then in the Middle Ages, it was developed further to mean hell is sort of what we might imagine, really from Dante's Inferno, but hell is sort of this fiery pit, right, that we get. So what's interesting here, I go through some of that just to reflect on the fact that the Judeo-Christian story has evolved and changed and grown. We've been influenced by other cultures and other religions, and thought process has grown and adapted and changed. And why would we imagine that's going to stop? Right? We continue on that path. Right? As Christians, we're following Jesus into the future, not looking back and saying, let's get back to what was. We're asking, God, where's your Spirit leading us into? Right? And so Jonah takes this 3 day and 3 night journey into the belly of the whale, into Sheol. In other ways, you could say Jonah felt engulfed. Jonah felt like he was going to the pit of hell. Jonah felt deep despair. Jonah had a hellish experience. Have you ever had something where you felt yourself in despair and darkness, engulfed, right? Have you ever had a hellish experience? I think most of us could say yes. And there's a second thing in here. If you noticed, there was a lot of language in Job's prayer about sea and the waters engulfing. And so what is meant by this word sea and waters? What was the imagery? What was Jonah getting at here? If we look at Genesis 1, the first creation story, Genesis 1, 1 through 2, we read the following. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape or form. It was dark over, notice this, the deep sea, and God's wind swept over the waters. So we have deep sea and we have waters. Notice how there's something there before God creates. There's the deep sea and the waters. In the ancient consciousness, sea represented chaos. It represented that which was untamed. And we see this being reflected actually in the story of Job, who's another story of somebody who experienced deep anguish and despair. Probably my favorite book in the Old Testament. And Job is crying out, and finally God answers Job. And we read in Job 38, 8 through 11, God speaking to Job says, "Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it and set bars and doors, and said, thus far you shall come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped." It's interesting. God is speaking to Jonah, confronting him and basically saying, I'm so beyond you. I'm so bigger than you can imagine. I tamed the seas. I shut the doors, right? And it is this ancient understanding that whatever God or gods, when they created, they tamed chaos, right? And so we see, again, this sort of understanding trickle in to the Hebrew consciousness in the whole Old Testament and in the stories of creation, right? Yahweh was the God who tamed the waters. In my seminary class, in the Hebrew Bible class, my Hebrew Bible professor said, as we started off in Genesis, says one of the main themes in the early part of this is the creation, is that God takes chaos and makes order. God takes disorder and creates something beautiful, right? And this is our vocation, invitation as well. We are meant to be people who follow and reflect the image of God by taking chaos and making something beautiful, by taking disorder and creating order, right? And so we do that in all of our lives. And you could say, taking this a little bit of a step further, you could say that according to the Genesis creation stories, that humans are giving the awful power of setting out where this whole story is going. That Yahweh creates and says, now you take and you run with it. And your choices will determine, do you produce righteousness and wholeness and love and justice, or do you take this and run it into the ground and produce division and hate and violence? It's up to you, right? We have that awful power, and we still do today. So Jonah endures this storm, right? Jonah endures this hardship, and it cracks him open. It breaks his heart open. And it's often, really, we learn from this too, I think, that it's often, a call often comes out of life storms, is what I'm trying to say. We hear something in those deep, awful parts of us. I'm not saying God causes that in all of our lives all the time, although in this story, according to this story, God caused this storm. But I think I can look at it differently and say sometimes we have storms in our lives. They're not all caused by God. They're not. In fact, most of them aren't. Most of them are human decisions or things that happen, right? And yet, in these storms, in the midst of these storms, often it breaks us open, right? So somebody who might go through a cancer diagnosis and come out on the other side might have some passion around helping other people, either helping work towards a cure or helping other people navigate, or maybe both. Some people, for example, who experience the violence of gun shootings. Sandy Hook gun shooting is one example. In 2012, on December 14th, a 20-year-old came with a gun and killed 20 children and 6 adults, and one of the most devastating school shootings ever. And a group of folks, people who had lost children and loved ones, came together and started a nonprofit and formed it and called it the Sandy Hook Promise. And if you go on their website, you'll read the statement. This is why they started it: to honor all victims of gun violence by turning our tragedy into a moment of transformation. You see that theme of disorder to order, tragedy to transformation, right? You can kind of see that theme of what do we do with the storms in our life, the difficult moments. And then they continue saying this: the Sandy Hook promise exists to empowering youth to know the signs and uniting all people who value the protection of children. We can take meaningful actions in schools, homes, and communities to prevent gun violence and stop the tragic loss of life. So sometimes a call comes out of a storm, or sometimes it comes out of a great experience, and sometimes a little bit of both. My own call to be a pastor, follow this journey, came out of my childhood, young adult, where church gave me belonging and community and connection, gave me a window in to connect with God and to grow spiritually as a person, right? And yet, at the same time, that same community, as I began to question and wrestle, kind of excluded me and created a lot of heartbreak, and I didn't quite fit in there. So I experienced what it's like to not feel that sense of belonging because I didn't align perfectly. And then I saw others, friends, family members who identified as a different sexual orientation, right? Or who wrestled with other theological questions, who were also excluded, some hurt, painful ways. And those both sort of formed me, right? The great experiences and the painful storms kind of formed me to be a pastor, but also to be a certain kind of pastor. See, these difficult seasons of despair, these hellish seasons, right, where you feel like you're engulfed, they form us in incredible ways if we can endure them. So how do we navigate these seasons? Talk about the Stockdale paradox here for a moment. James Stockdale was a pilot who shot down in the Vietnam War in 1965. He was a prisoner of war for 7.5 years, endured all kinds of hardship and torture and malnourishment, and survived. And what he noticed is some people didn't survive. And this is what he wrote about the Stockdale principle, or the paradox. He said this: "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." So there's a paradox here, right? The first part of this is you have to be honest about your situation. You have to look at it in the face. And James Stockdale said many of the people that didn't survive were overly naively optimistic. Tomorrow I'll get out. By Christmas I'll get out. Instead of facing, this is my situation. I am here. I am here. This is the reality. And it helps if we're feeling those things. Psychologists tell us it helps if we can name it and be specific. I feel this way because of this. Right? I don't like this because of this. I want this because of this. The more specific we can get at it, the more we can face whatever it is that our reality is. But here's what I think often happens. We'd rather numb it down, right? This is true about me. I'd rather stuff it, right? Numb it out. And I think this is what's happening. And part of the result of anxiety and depression growing is we live more and more disconnected, but then we try to numb it instead of facing it, because it's harder to face things, right? It's easier to sort of numb it. Food or drink or alcohol or TV, right? Or shopping, right? Retail therapy. We use that to try to cover it up, which actually keeps us stuck in this cycle, right? Instead of first facing it. And what's the second part of the paradox? Because there's always two parts to every paradox. Is the second part is we maintain hope that a way out or a way through will come. A way out and a way through. So we have to stare at it, say, this is my reality, and yet I'm trusting somehow, some way we're going to make it. I'm not going to try to be overly optimistic. I'm not going to, say this is going to end tomorrow. I don't know when it will end. I don't know when I'll get through this, but I have hope and I trust. Anne Lamott writes this: "Hope begins in the dark. The stubborn hope that if you just show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come. You wait and you watch and you work. You don't give up." So if you're experiencing that, hope begins in the dark. It begins with I'm not going to give up. It will come. Martin Luther King said, "We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope." Kind of reflects this idea of the Stockdale paradox, right? We must name our reality and also trust that someday, somehow, somewhere, we're going to get through this reality. We maintain hope often by telling stories, right? Narratives. And we also stay stuck sometimes by the narratives and the loops, right? I'm an Enneagram 9. one of the things I'm really noticing and trying to work on is what loop I play in my mind is you're not good enough. You're not important enough. Nobody needs to hear your voice. Nobody needs to stare at a screen and hear what you have to say. Why are you doing this, Aaron? Right? Those are the things that run through my mind. And like, yeah, why do I need to? Somebody else can do it better than me, right? So those are the stories in my mind. What stories do you tell you? What stories do you tell yourself? Are there stories that keep you from stepping out, or keep you from taking that job, or keeping you from reaching for that relationship or promotion or whatever it is? What stories are you telling yourself? Jonah was a story about a prophet, but it was also a story about other people, and about a God who was extending grace and love and compassion to people that were deemed enemies. And it was through this journey, through the depths of Sheol, where Jonah was cracked open. And then we read this again in verse 2. I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Out of the depths, out of the despair, God, you heard me. You heard me. Jonah is about a prophet resisting God, but how far God will go to bring about hope and healing to those we might not personally deem worthy. This is the power of the different narrative, right? Speaking of those narratives that we tell ourselves, right? We live in I don't know if you feel this way. I feel we live in this weird, bizarre world where facts don't matter. Like, where people seem to, I don't know if this has been your experience. People seem to make up things. Like, you see this on the news, you see this, it's like, where did that come from? Like, that's not even close to being true, but somehow people believe it. And then when you're presented with facts, they're like, eh. J.K. Galbraith, who's an economist, once wrote this: faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there is no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy with the proof. This is true of all of us too, right? Every single one of us. If we're faced with something that doesn't align with what we already think, what are we going to do? We're going to try to go and disprove that. That's our natural inclination, right? So it helps just to know how human psychology works, and also helps to know how human anthropology works. I found this extremely helpful for me, especially when I'm like, what, trying to make sense of what's going on politically, religiously, and just in general in our world. James Clear, he authored a book titled Atomic Habits. It's a New York Times bestseller, but he writes this about in the book. He says, humans are herd animals. We want to fight to fit in, to bond with others, and to earn the respect and approval of our peers. Such inclinations are essential to our survival. For most of our evolutionary history, our ancestors lived in tribes. Becoming separated from the tribe, or worst, being cast out, was a death sentence. There's a lot of truth here that I think, especially modern, more progressive thinking folks, forget. When we become frustrated about people not accepting facts or seeing facts. That could be anything from religious, politically, to also just the environmental crisis we're in, where people are like, nah, I don't believe that. You're like, what? So it doesn't matter, you present the facts, right? Well, part of this is we're tribal herd animals, right? And we belong to a tribe. And so we've sort of evolved, and it makes sense, right, to survive in a tribe, right? More hands make more work, right? More eyes allow us to see danger. So we want to be in a tribe. And this, in a follow-up in an article that James Clear wrote, the article was Why Facts Don't Change Our Mind. And he wrote this. I think this is powerful. So I'm going to read it slowly. Convincing someone to change their mind is really the process of convincing them to change their tribe. If they abandon their beliefs, they run the risk of losing social ties. You can't expect someone to change their mind if you take away their community too. You have to give them somewhere to go. Nobody wants their worldview torn apart if loneliness is the outcome. In a world where facts don't matter as much, where people seem to create whatever. There's something deeper going on here. There's a tribal connection going on, that people aren't willing to sort of leave their tribe because they don't want to experience loneliness. Like, for me, I shared a little bit of my story, and perhaps you have a similar story. You grew up in a tribe, in a religious group that connected was great, but for one reason or another, it stopped working. And I can't tell you the excruciating pain, the feeling of confusion and loss and disorientation, rejection that I felt. I didn't feel like I was walking away from God. I felt like I was being honest about things. And this was before all these podcasts talk about deconstruction and books came out and reframing the Bible. This was before the Bible for Normal People, Pete Enns, all that, where I was just like, I felt lost and confused. And I lost my tribe, right? I lost that connection. So looking back, I can understand why that's so hard. Is because then you have to look for something else, another tribe, another community. This is why I think faith communities like The Well are so important, because if people are going to shift or change or evolve, it's super hard if you don't have somewhere else to go. But if you have another church community to go to that takes the Bible seriously, that seeks to follow Jesus and live and inspire life, right? If you don't have another community to go to, it's so much harder. And honestly, if I'm going to be frank, I think we need more and more people to shift. I think there are more loving, more just ways to be in the world. If we want people to shift and change, then we need to provide new community, which leads me to this truth. Facts don't change people's mind. Friendship does. I'm going to kind of end our time here today. Facts don't change people's mind. Friendship does. When I was talking to my wife about sharing the sermon on Jonah 2, and she knows the story. She's like, so have you ever told God no and ran the other direction? And my immediate thing was like, no, I know I haven't always said a big yes, but I don't know that I've ran in the opposite direction. And then through this sermon, actually, as I was exploring it, the topic of really our hardwiredness for belonging and community and tribes, and the importance of relationship, I realized, in some ways I have. I've gone like Jonah and said, I don't want to talk to these people anymore. This is hard. I don't understand. They frustrate me and they anger me. So I began to distance myself. This has happened over the last 5 years, more than any other time in my life, because it's easier to disconnect. And there's family and there's friends and there's relationships that I've kind of withdrawn from it. I do want to say this honestly. Sometimes we need healthy boundaries. We do. People that trigger us or anger us on a regular basis, you just need to create those boundaries and say no and step away. And if you're feeling like that, just give yourself permission for that, please. Right? But there's also this reality that if we expect and hope and want people to change, then we have to stay in relationship with them. And I searched my heart and I said, sometimes it's easier for me probably to feel a little bit like Jonah, a little bit self-righteous. Those people don't deserve it, right? So I'm going to disconnect and go the opposite way. Here's the reality. We need people to change. We need people to become more inclusive, more loving, more understanding, more graceful, to work and to see systemic injustice and racism in our world and our society. And we need people desperately to realize the crisis in our environment that we face today. It's not going to happen apart from relationship. Relationship is key. So hopefully you heard something in what I shared today that spoke to you, challenged you, invited you. Jonah is meant to comfort and disturb us, right? And challenge us, but also say God is working through all of our decisions and all of it to bring about a more expansive love. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, for those of us who are going through Sheol, who are going on the 3 days and 3 nights journey, who feel engulfed, who feel taken down into the underworld, who feel they are in a season of despair, I pray for comfort. May they find comfort in knowing they are not alone, and may they find comfort in knowing that it's part of the human condition. and that through that you are still walking with them, whether they can feel it or not. And may they sense that they are not alone in that. God, I pray for some of us who may have distanced ourselves out of self-righteousness or even just anger or frustration or lack of patience. Help us to realize how important staying connected in relationships are. And God, in this crazy world that we live in, may we continue to patiently, compassionately work, take on the authority and the power that's been given to us to direct this all of creation towards something that the Hebrew people called shalom, towards more healing and hope. In all of our relationships and all of our interactions, when we vote, and when we vote by the dollars that we spend and who we spend time with and what we put our energy toward, may it be moving us towards this shalom. We ask these things through Christ, we pray. Amen.